Sickness Unto Death is a book written by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard in 1849 under the pen name Antifragile. It's about his idea on despair, which he links to the Christian idea of sin, calling it the sin of despair. Very much related to his other books, Fear and Trembling and the concept of anxiety. This is episode 33. I hope you are enjoying this podcast. And if you are, please help me get this in front of like-minded people by sharing it with your friends, your family, leaving a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple, and subscribing with the bell if you're on YouTube, so that you'll know when all the new episodes come out. Let's get into it. Every human being is primitively intended to be a self, destined to become himself. And as such, every self certainly is angular, but that only means that it is to be ground into shape. Not that it is to be ground down smooth. Not that it is utterly to abandon being itself out of fear of men, or even simply out of fear of men not to dare to be itself in its more essential contingency, which definitely is not to be ground down smooth, in which a person is still himself for himself. But whereas one kind of despair plunges wildly into the infinite and loses itself, another kind of despair seems to permit itself to be tricked out of itself by the others. Surrounded by hordes of men, absorbed in all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the way of the world, such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too hazardous to be himself, and far easier and safer to be like others, to become a copy, a number, a mass man. Now this form of despair goes practically unnoticed in the world. Just by losing himself this way, such a man has gained an increasing capacity for going along superbly in business and social life, indeed for making a great success in the world. Here there is no delay, no difficulty with his self and its infinitizing. He is as smooth as a rolling stone, as courant, passable as a circulating coin. He is far from being regarded as a person in despair that he is just what a human being is supposed to be. As is natural, the world generally has no understanding of what is truly appalling. The despair that not only does not cause one any inconvenience in life, but makes life cozy and comfortable is in no way, of course, regarded as despair. That this is the world's view is borne out, for example, by practically all the proverbs, which are nothing more than rules of prudence. For example, we say that one regrets 10 times for having spoken to once for having kept silent. And why? Because the external facts of having spoken can involve one in difficulties, since it is an actuality. But to have kept silent. And yet, this is the most dangerous of all. For by maintaining silence, a person is thrown wholly upon himself. Here, actuality does not come to his aid by punishing him, by heaping the consequences of his speaking upon him. No, in this respect, it is easy to keep silent. But the person who knows what is genuinely appalling fears most of all any mistake, any sin that takes an inward turn and leaves no outward trace. The world considers it dangerous to venture in this way. And why? Because it is possible to lose. Not to venture is prudent, and yet precisely by not venturing, it is so terribly easy to lose what would be hard to lose. However much one lost by risking, and in any case never this way, so easily, so completely, as if it were nothing at all, namely oneself. If I have ventured wrongly, well then, life helps me by punishing me. But if I have not ventured at all, who helps me then? Moreover, if by not venturing at all in the highest sense, and to venture in the highest sense is precisely to become aware of oneself, I cowardly gain all the earthly advantages and lose myself. That was an excerpt from Sickness Unto Death by Søren Kierkegaard. And as I mentioned in the intro, Kierkegaard wrote this book under the pen name Antifragile. The book starts with a reference to the Bible, specifically a line from the Gospel of John, which reads, "This sickness is not unto death." And it's spoken when Jesus' friend Lazarus dies, and Jesus asks to resurrect Lazarus from the dead, and he does so. Kierkegaard, through Anticlimacus, raises an interesting question. He says, would the statement still hold true if Jesus hadn't raised Lazarus? Because the Christian view is that death isn't the end, but it's just a step on the way to eternal life. You have to die to gain eternal life. So we shouldn't fear death at all. Instead, what Kierkegaard is trying to get at is that we should fear living in despair. And real despair is the scary kind. Real despair is the kind of death that you cannot die from. So in the book, he describes 3 different types of fear. 1 is not knowing you have a self. 2 is not wanting to be yourself. And 3, the feeling that you aren't yourself. And Kierkegaard believes that a person is in despair if they don't align themselves with God or God's plan for them. And it is through this state that you lose your true self. So he writes on page 46, every human existence that is not conscious of itself as spirit or conscious of itself before God as spirit. Every human existence that does not rest transparently in God, but vaguely rests in and merges in some abstract universality, state, nation, etc., or in the dark about his self, regards his capacity merely as powers to produce without becoming deeply aware of their source, regards his self, if it is to have intrinsic meaning, as an indefinable something. Every such existence, whatever it achieves, be it most amazing, whatever it explains, be it the whole of existence, however intensively it enjoys life aesthetically, every such existence is nevertheless despair. From the excerpt I read in the beginning, and just on this quote, you can tell that Kierkegaard is very passionate about this. He's trying to drive home to his audience, to his readers, that you have to address despair in your life. Because if you don't address it, it's going to haunt you. And he ends up saying that most of us live our life as if we're not in despair. And he says that's the worst kind of despair because you're living in ignorance. At least somebody who understands and who's struggling through despair is struggling through that. Whereas you might be either distracted or you're completely unaware of it. And being completely unaware of it is the worst kind. Kierkegaard goes on to define self as a kind of a relationship that you have with yourself. And I'm quoting here, relations relating itself to itself in the relation. Lots of relating words in here. And what he means by relations relating itself to itself in relation is a balancing of 2 opposites, the finite and the infinite, or the finitude and the infinitude. And your ability to confront yourself, your being, your existence, and coming to peace with it. And the way you get to peace with it for Kierkegaard is through God, of course, and through having faith in God. And for Kierkegaard, this balance is what makes us human. To be a true self, one must realize that the source of this self, that you and I, is love. And love is the power that created everything. But if you misunderstand the nature of the self, or of this creative power, you fall into despair. Now, throughout the whole book, Kierkegaard has this concept of dialectic, and it plays a very important role in Sickness Unto Death and in his other books as well. And what he means by dialectic is this 3-step process. There is the aesthetic stage. This is the stage of a person's life. The aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, the religious state. Each transcending and absorbing the previous one. And it's how you as a spirit becomes an individual instantiation of a human existence that's concrete versus a more Platonic understanding of humankind or human nature, which according to Kierkegaard doesn't really exist. That all human existence is concrete and there is no such abstract notions as humankind. And it's important to understand these different stages because it plays into how we address despair, how there are different nuances in despair. The aesthetic stage is essentially somebody who is absorbed with self-gratification, is in the pursuit of pleasure. There's no difference whether the meaning of life is getting hooked on drugs, living a life of debauchery, like say Leo Tolstoy before he finds meaning, or spending all your time in luxury with no care for the world. For Kierkegaard, this is the aesthetic stage. Whether you're hooked on drugs or whether you're spending your time doing luxurious things, both opposites are in pursuit of self-gratification and doesn't move you beyond this self-gratification. Yourself, the self here, is not transcending. For to transcend, you have to ask yourself, do I want to continue glorifying my self-absorbed pleasures, or do I want the self to transcend through my commitment to the ethical? And the moment you make that commitment to the ethical, the moment you say, I no longer want to pursue self-gratification, you then make this leap forward into the ethical stage. And then from there, you make another commitment to the religious stage. It's important, though, to note that when Kierkegaard's talking about religion, and in Sickness Unto Death, he's talking about Christianity, he's referring to individual faith, not religious as accepted by the world and by the society at this point in time. He absolutely despises people who simply observe religious moral codes of ethics but are dead inside. It could be fasting, for example, because it's Lent, or because, let's say, it's Ramadan. But if the rest of your life outside of Lent or outside of Ramadan does not live up to the moral code of ethics, does not live up to living a life of self-denial, of love, of patience, of loving your neighbor, then he says you're dead inside. You're just doing this as a show. And during Kierkegaard's time, many Christians were doing this, right? They were attending churches, taking communion, participating in rites, doing daily prayers, because they thought that if I did all these things, then my life will be happy and I'll be peaceful and I will have no despair, and that I've lived a good life. But Kierkegaard says, no, that's not what it means to be a Christian. That's not what it means to have faith specifically. And this is why within Christian circles, Kierkegaard is either absolutely hated or he's absolutely loved. And it's also why he's considered one of the greatest existentialist philosophers. And finally, on this point, for Kierkegaard, the Christianity during his time, he says, it has been too domesticated. They've prostituted the Christian faith so that discipleship is easy. They've removed all the difficulty. They've made it super comfortable. It no longer challenged the believers. And therefore, he says, you have made this whole faith, which is supposed to be difficult, which is supposed to engage your whole being, no different than prostitution. Because with prostitutes, to get sex, you simply pay money and you get sex. And so he says with Christianity, it's like that. It's too easy. And that's not the kind of Christianity that Kierkegaard believes the true faith is. Now, the book, Sickness Unto Death, describes 3 types of despair. One is not knowing yourself, as I mentioned, and not wanting to be yourself. And the third is feeling that you aren't yourself. The first type comes from your ignorance. It's an inauthentic despair. You don't realize you have a self that's more than just the infinite reality. The second type, not wanting to be yourself, is when you know you have a self, but wish you didn't, and you're trying to avoid this awareness by focusing only on immediate finite things, distracting yourself constantly. And the third kind, that's feeling that you aren't yourself, is recognizing yourself, that you have it, but you're not accepting that it depends on love, that it depends specifically on God. You might accept eternity or even acknowledge love as a real existing thing, but you refuse to embrace that part of yourself that is love. And he says this kind of despair is demonic. As we've discussed in other episodes, one of the recurring themes is around love. It's around the importance of embracing love. It's around the importance of self-sacrificial love that you have for your brother, for your sister, for your neighbor. And it is, according to history's greatest minds, the only way to transcend the finite, to attain enlightenment, to attain and achieve a complete state of peace. And here with Kierkegaard, he is getting to that point. Right? He is getting there by saying the worst kind of despair, this despair that he calls demonic, is one that rejects love. So he writes on page 48, very often the person in despair probably has a very dim idea of his own state. Meaning that the person who's in despair doesn't really fully grasp the dire nature of what he is struggling through or what he's going through. So then he asks, where then does despair come from? And he gives his own answer. From the relation in which the synthesis relates itself to itself. Inasmuch as God, who constitutes man a relation, releases it from his hand as it were, that is, inasmuch as the relation relates itself to itself. And when he says synthesis, he's talking about the infinitude and the finitude. So the despair comes because man is constituted with this paradoxical nature of infinitude and finitude. And when God has released man from himself, from his own hands, the despair arises when man cannot unite the infinitude and the finitude. That is where it all begins. Kierkegaard writes, this concept, the sickness unto death, must however be understood in a particular way. Literally, it means a sickness of which the end and the result are death. Therefore, we use the expression fatal sickness as synonymous with the sickness unto death. In that sense, despair cannot be called the sickness unto death. He says the despair cannot be called sickness unto death because despair is the kind of thing that death does not alleviate you from. Dying does not make your despair go away. It actually makes it worse. Page after that, Kierkegaard writes, when death is the greatest danger, we hope for life. But when we learn to know the even greater danger, we hope for death. When the danger is so great that death becomes the hope, then despair is the hopelessness of not even being able to die. When you realize that there is something worse than death, something that not even death could cure your sickness, that is real despair. And Kierkegaard here is saying everyone is suffering from despair. And by everyone, he means every single person who's ever existed has suffered from this despair. And though it may not look like it on the surface, you might have friends who you think are living great, extremely peaceful, happy lives with no despair. Kierkegaard says, either they're lying to themselves, or they don't know they're in despair, or they are struggling through that despair and simply putting up a facade that they are not in despair. Kierkegaard wants you to know that to be ignorant of despair is much worse than to struggle through it. He writes later on, a person in despair despairingly wills to be himself, but if he despairingly wills to be himself, he certainly does not want to be rid of himself. Well, so it seems, but upon closer examination, it is clear that the contradiction is the same. The self that he despairingly wants to be is a self that he is not. For to will to be the self that he is in truth is the very opposite of despair. That is, he wants to tear his self away from the power that established it. You won't find peace. You won't get rid of your despair by seeking to be somebody else, to be another version of yourself that does not have despair. In wanting to be this other self, what you end up doing is you end up tearing yourself away from the power, which is love, that established this concrete self that you are. If you continually desire something that you don't have, if you continually live a life as if you're always missing something, whatever that is, it could be anything from wanting more money to more status to more friends to more lovers, the list goes on and on. You'll never overcome your despair because you continually are separating yourself. You're continually expanding the chasm within yourself instead of bringing the two paradoxical sides of a human being, yourself, the infinitude and the finitude. You are causing a greater chasm between yourself, and the despair simply gets worse and worse. So he writes, to despair over oneself, in despair, to will to be rid of oneself, this is the formula for all despair. I repeat, to despair over oneself, in despair, to will to be rid of oneself. This is the formula for all despair. If you're lamenting over yourself, over your despair, because you don't want to be in despair, he says, this is simply going to make the whole thing even worse. And I'm continuing, he writes later on, the self is composed of infinitude and finitude. However, the synthesis is a relation. and a relation that, even though it is derived, relates itself to itself, which is freedom. The self is freedom, but freedom is the dialectical aspect of the categories of possibility and necessity. Again, only by merging these two opposites, the infinite and the finite, you will find freedom here, because you will then be your true self. And it is only in the realization that you are neither only finite and neither are you only infinite that you are able to find the freedom to be, to exist. I made a note here that it reminded me of how in Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, the way you break the illusion, the Maya, is by the experiential realization that the Atman, self, is Brahman, the ultimate reality. When you have this realization, you break free from this illusion that we live in, that you and I are different from each other. I briefly spoke about this in the episode on the Bhagavad Gita, that's number 28, and again briefly on the episode with the desert monks, which is episode 29. Now, having said this and having written this note, the difference with Kierkegaard here is that when he says infinitude and when he says finitude, right? Infinitude here means your limitless potential for imagination, for creativity. That's what he means by infinitude, right? You have this capacity to think an unlimited amount of thoughts and have unlimited amounts of creativity. And when he says finitude, here he's meaning this concrete human existence, this flesh and bone, this interaction that I have with you. And for Kierkegaard, what binds these two things together is love. And the love that powers everything is God. For Kierkegaard, in your struggle to overcome despair, you can get help and you can also give help. And he gives a warning that if you are able to help but you do not help, you might potentially, if not probably, lose yourself because you have not ventured out in love. So I read, "But if I have not ventured at all, who helps me then? Moreover, what if by not venturing at all in the highest sense, and to venture in the highest sense is precisely to become aware of oneself, I cowardly gain all the earthly advantages and lose myself?" In your self-sacrificial act of reaching out and helping somebody else, he's saying the only people who are able to do this is one who has realized their true self, who has become aware of themselves. He says this is the highest sense of calling. And if you do this, you have not only love, but you are acting in love. But if you don't do this, if you cower away from this, you might instead find that you have gained all the advantages that this world has to offer you. But in so doing, you would have lost yourself. Obviously, Kierkegaard, being a Christian, is drawing from when Jesus says, "What profits a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul?" So if you see somebody in need of help, reach out, help them. Don't cower away. Don't be selfish. But also remember that there are people who outwardly express that they want help, but they really don't want help. And on page 71, Kierkegaard talks about them. He writes, "But when having to be helped becomes a profoundly earnest matter, especially when it means being helped by a superior or by the Supreme One," here he means God, "there is the humiliation of being obligated to accept any kind of help unconditionally, of becoming a nothing in the hand of the helper, for whom all things are possible, or the humiliation of simply having to yield to another person, of giving up being himself as long as he is seeking help. Yet, there is undoubtedly much suffering, even prolonged and agonizing suffering, in which the self nevertheless is not pained in this way, and therefore it fundamentally prefers the suffering along with the retention of being itself." And some people, when they realize that there is a sense of humility, of humiliation as he calls it, that occurs when somebody is helping you, they refuse the helping hand, even if it's from God. There's a funny analogy that he draws between what it's like to be ignorant of your own despair. He writes, "If a man is presumably happy, imagines himself to be happy, although considered in the light of truth he is unhappy, he is usually far from wanting to be wrenched out of his error. On the contrary, he becomes indignant. He regards anyone who does so as his worst enemy. He regards it as an assault bordering on murder, in the sense that, as is said, it murders his happiness. Why? Because he is completely dominated by the sensate and the sensate psychical, because he lives in sensate categories, the pleasant and the unpleasant, wave goodbye to spirit and truth, etc. Because he is too sensate to have the courage to venture out and to endure being spirit. However vain and conceited men may be, they usually have a very meager conception of themselves. Nevertheless, that is, they have no conception of being spirit, the absolute that a human being can be, but vain and conceited they are. On the basis of comparison, imagine a house with a basement, first floor, and a second floor, planned so that there is, or is supposed to be, a social distinction between the occupants according to the floor. Now, if what it means to be a human being is compared with such a house, then all too regrettably, the sad and ludicrous truth about the majority of people is that in their own house they prefer to live in the basement. Every human being is a psychical physical synthesis intended to be spirit, that is, the building, but he prefers to live in the basement, that is, in the sensate categories. Moreover, he not only prefers to live in the basement, no, he loves it so much that he is indignant if anyone suggests that he move to the superb upper floor that stands vacant and at his disposal, for he is, after all, living in his own house. Two things going on here with this man. This man prefers to live in the basement, prefers to get mad at people who say that, look, you can actually live in this first floor or in the second floor, right? This whole house is yours, but the higher you go up in the house, the more beautiful the house gets and the more glorious your living will be and your existence. And the man knows this intellectually and says, no, I prefer where I live. Or the other thing that's going on here is somebody who is completely ignorant that even though this house that he lives in is his, he bravely and dubiously thinks that the basement is all that there is, that his whole life is supposed to be dedicated to self-gratification, to his sensates. There's nothing beyond this. He's very nihilistic in his approach, and the basement is where that nihilism exists. And he is unable to transcend from the aesthetic to the ethical to the religious stage. And the warning Kierkegaard is giving here specifically is that you not be like this man who falsely believes the basement is how his existence is meant to be, and to fall into the trap that this is happiness, that this is peace, that this is a life of no despair. But when you look at this situation objectively, you realize that this man's happiness is actually anything but happiness. His peace is simply a powerful form of despair that prevents him from seeing reality as is. He cannot break through the Maya, the illusion. One of the most common forms of despair is like the man who lives in the basement and says, oh, I should probably move up to the first or second floor. But instead of doing that, he distracts himself with the trivialities of, cleaning his basement or spending his time doing things that don't actually matter, that don't actually help him move to the next floor up and beyond that. So Kierkegaard writes, melancholically enamored, the individual pursues one of anxiety's possibilities, which finally leads him away from himself so that he is a victim of anxiety, or a victim of that about which he was so anxious lest he be overcome. It's this idea that you are so overcome by the anxiety of this despair that you become a victim of your own anxiousness. And when you become a victim of your own anxiety, you are unable to act. You are unable to do anything beyond it. Your initial intention to overcome the anxiety becomes so overwhelming that you then are trapped in this anxious cycle of wanting to overcome the despair. And so what you can end up doing is you can end up distracting yourself, surrounding yourself with other people who are also in despair but are trying to overcome it but are too anxious by it, and so they don't actually do anything about it. And Kierkegaard writes, but whereas one kind of despair plunges wildly into the infinite and loses itself, another kind of despair seems to permit itself to be tricked out of itself by the others. Surrounded by hordes of men, absorbed in all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the ways of the world, such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too hazardous to be himself, and far easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, a mass man. Now, this form of despair goes practically unnoticed in the world. Just by losing himself this way, such a man has gained an increasing capacity for going along superbly in business and social life, indeed, for making a great success in the world. You get caught up in the game of covering your despair up by distracting yourself. You distract yourself by achieving success in everything but overcoming despair. And because of that, from the outside perspective, from the external perspective, you look like you've made great success, great leaps in this world. But for Kierkegaard, he knows beyond. He can see through the facade that you've put up. He says, this person, you have forgotten yourself. You've forgotten your name that divinely understood. You actually no longer believe in yourself because you find it too hazardous, too dangerous to be truly yourself. And instead, it becomes easier for you because you are no longer wanting to be yourself. You're afraid of your true self, that you end up copying the world around you. And that's why he says, to become a copy, a number, a mass man. And in so doing, you find praises from the same group of people who you're copying, because they too are copying somebody else. And why Kierkegaard goes on to say, now this form of despair goes practically unnoticed in the world. Just by losing himself this way, such a man has gained an increasing capacity for going along superbly in business and social life, indeed for making a great success in the world. Kierkegaard, passionate, he's trying to wake his readers up, he's trying to wake us up. And he's saying, don't you see the mistake that you're making? Don't you see the lies that you're existing in? Wake up from here. Wake up from this nightmare that you're living in, which you think is a beautiful life. He's saying, you think you have peace because you have all these things. But in reality, when you are truly honest with yourself, you know for a fact that you don't have peace because you have forgotten who you are, because you dare not be yourself, and you've failed to believe in yourself. You, he says, are living a domesticated life. And a domesticated life is one where you never engage in grappling and overcoming despair, the real sickness in your life. And this is why he says, this is a state of despair. No matter how much the despairing person avoids it, no matter how successful he has completely lost himself, especially the case in the part that is ignorance of being in despair, and lost himself in such a manner that the loss is not at all detectable. Eternity, nevertheless, will make it manifest that his condition was despair, and will nail him to himself so that his torment will still be that he cannot rid himself of his self, and will become obvious that he was just imagining that he had succeeded in doing so. For 80 years, you might never ever consider despair because either you're ignorant of it or because you've tried to confront it once when you were younger but failed to do so, and so you have stuffed it away in the back corner of your house and never ever thought about it again. But even if you did that, even if you completely lose yourself, as he writes, and lose yourself in such a way that it becomes hard to detect, eventually, 80 years later, it will manifest itself and I quote, will nail him to himself so that his torment will still be that he cannot rid himself of his self. Kierkegaard is stressing that you cannot ever get rid of yourself. You cannot ever hide and run away from despair, no matter how long you successfully do it for while you are here. Somewhere down the line, whether that's the end of your life, in the middle of it all, in the high of your life, or in the super lows of your life, it will manifest itself. The despair is like your shadow. It is always with you, even though the only times you don't see it are when you're not looking down or when you're not outside in the light, in the sun. But the moment you step out, the moment you turn on the light, the moment the sun shines on you, your shadow will appear. And that is just like despair. And related to this, Kierkegaard writes about somebody who is spending their life distracting themselves from this existential dread. And I read, he appropriates what he, in his language, calls his self. That is, whatever capacities, talents, etc. he may have. All these he appropriates, but in an outward bound direction, toward life, as they say, toward the real, the active life. He behaves very discreetly with the little bit of reflection he has within himself, fearing that what he has in the background might emerge again. Little by little, he manages to forget it. In the course of time, he finds it almost ludicrous, especially when he is together with other competent and dynamic men who have a sense and aptitude for real life. Charming! He has been happily married now for several years, as it says in the novels, is a dynamic and enterprising man, a father, a citizen, perhaps even an important man. At home in his own house, the servants call him he himself. Downtown, he is among those addressed with his honor. His conduct is based on respect of persons or on the way others regard one, and the others judge according to one's social position. In Christendom, he is a Christian, in the very same sense as in paganism he would be a pagan, and in Holland a Hollander. One of the cultured Christians. The question of immortality has often occupied him, and more than once he has asked the pastor whether there is such an immortality, whether one would actually recognize himself again, something that certainly must be of very particular interest to him, since he has no self. It is impossible to depict this kind of despair accurately without a certain touch of satire. It is comical that he wants to talk about having been in despair. It is appalling that after the conquering of despair, according to his view, his condition is in fact despair. Ideally understood, it is extremely comical that underlying the worldly wisdom that is so celebrated in the world, underlying all the diabolical profusion of good advice and clever cliches, wait and see, don't worry, forget it, there is utter stupidity about where and what the danger actually is. Again, it is this ethical stupidity that is appalling. Despair over the earthly or something earthly is the most common form of despair, and especially in the second form, that is, immediacy with a quantitative reflection. The more despair is thought through, the more rarely it is seen or the more rarely it appears in the world. This by no means proves that the majority have not despair. It proves only that they have not gone particularly deep in despairing. This man that Kierkegaard talks about is the majority of us. The majority of us are distracted by the noise around us, and we constantly distract ourselves and think that we've overcome this despair. We are respected in the communities. We are loved by friends and family. We live a life of somebody who seems to have overcome despair. But Kierkegaard's saying, this man, he's only done a little bit of self-reflection. And he's unwilling to go deeper because he knows the moment he goes deeper, his whole world around him is going to crumble. All the things that he thought was important, all the trivialities, all the vanities that he thinks is important, it's all going to crumble around him. And therefore, he's actually unwilling to do it. He's unwilling to face true despair. And Kierkegaard here is lamenting for us because he wants us to go deep. He wants us to confront the despair, to confront your mortality, to confront your finiteness. He goes on to say, as stated, this kind of despair is quite rare in the world. If it does not stop there and just mark time on the spot, and if, on the other hand, the person in despair does not experience an upheaval that puts him on the right road of faith, despair of this kind will either become intensified in a higher form of despair or continue to be in closing reserve, or it will break through and destroy the outward trappings in which such a despairing person has been living out his life as if in an incognito. In the latter case, a person of this kind of despair will hurl himself into life, perhaps into the diversions of great enterprises. He will become a restless spirit whose life certainly leaves a mark, a restless spirit who wants to forget, and when the internal tumult is too much for him, he has to take strong measure, although of another kind than Richard III used in order not to hear his mother's curse, or he will seek oblivion in sensuality, perhaps in dissolute living. In despair, he wants to go back to immediacy, and always with the consciousness of the self he does not want to be in. Again, what he's saying here is when you confront this despair, truly confront it, you will experience an upheaval that will put you on the right track to faith, to belief in love, to embrace love. A despair that, if you ignore it, will become intensified and will continue to break you. But most people are afraid that it will break them. Most people are afraid that all this outward appearances that they have cultivated over the years and years will simply crumble because they can see through to reality. They can see reality for itself beyond the illusion. And so anybody who tries to avoid this, Kierkegaard says, he will become a restless spirit whose life certainly leaves a mark. And when he says leaves a mark, it means it leaves a mark on the world, whether that's in business, whether that's in politics, whether that's in any other field. It will leave a mark because the person is pouring all his energy, all his thought into anything but confronting it, because that allows him to avoid this dreadful, terrifying idea that perhaps what he's doing is actually all meaningless. And so then, because he has a restless spirit and he wants to forget despair, he ends up being remembered in this world by others and gains the earthly praises but loses his soul in the process. Kierkegaard tells a story of somebody who makes money and is able to afford, new pairs of pants, socks, and drinks. And he says, people who avoid despair by focusing on externalities are like this person. I'm reading a quote. The man of immediacy does not know himself. He quite literally identifies himself only by the clothes he wears. He identifies having a self by the externalities. Here again, the infinitely comical. There is a hardly more ludicrous mistake, for a self is indeed infinitely distinct from an externality. So when the externals have completely changed, for the person of immediacy and he has despaired, he goes one step further. He thinks something like this. It becomes his wish. What if I became someone else, got myself a new self? What if he did become someone else? I wonder whether he would recognize himself. There's a story about a peasant who went barefooted to town with enough money to buy himself a pair of stockings and shoes and to get drunk. And in trying to find his way home in his drunken state, he fell asleep in the middle of the road. A carriage came along, and the driver shouted to him to move or he would drive over his legs. The drunken peasant woke up, looked at his legs, and not recognizing them because of the shoes and the stockings, said, "Go ahead, they are not my legs." When the man of immediacy despairs, it is impossible to give a true description of him outside of the comic. The point that he's making is that you will fail to see yourself, you will fail to recognize who you are because you have forgotten in your state of avoiding despair who you truly are. And so when despair happens, it is comical, it is laughable, because you've spent your whole life avoiding it. All this brings us to Kierkegaard's idea of sin, and it plays a huge role. And sin is what intensifies your despair. He writes, sin is before God or with the conception of God, in despair not to will to be oneself, or in despair to will to be oneself. Thus sin is intensified weakness or intensified defiance. Sin is the intensification of despair. So sin is before God, not one willing to be yourself. Somebody who creates a chasm between himself, has not unified the infinitude and the finitude. Or the opposite of somebody who's in despair and wants to will himself, or wants to be somebody else. And when you have this concept of sin, it makes your despair worse. Not only that, persistent sin in your life makes it difficult for you to transcend from the aesthetic to the ethical to the religious. If you remember, the aesthetic life is one of vanity, ethical is one who has made an ethical commitment, and the religious one is one living a life of concrete devotion to his faith. So Kierkegaard writes, by sin, that is, by despairing over his sin, he has lost all relation to grace and also to himself. His selfish self culminates in ambition. He has now, in fact, become the king, and yet in despairing over his sin and of the reality of repentance, of grace, he has also lost himself. He cannot even keep on going by himself, and he is no closer to enjoying himself at the height of his ambition than he is to grasping grace. And through continual sin in your life, according to Kierkegaard, you are unable to confront despair. And so what you end up doing, you end up focusing all your mind towards, as he says, selfish self culminates in ambition. And you become the king. And yet, even in your kingship, you are no closer to enjoying yourself. You're no closer to understanding who you truly are, because you have not confronted that despair in your life. And you are far from grace, according to Kierkegaard. And he brings up Socrates here when he writes, the Socratic definition works out in the following way. When someone does not do what is right, then neither has he understood what is right. His understanding is purely imaginary. His declaration of having understood is false information. His repeated protestation that he will be hanged if he has not understood puts him far, far along the most roundabout way. Kierkegaard is expounding on this idea of sin. He's saying, look, when you do something that is wrong, you have not understood what is right. And you don't have a good conception of what is good. And that's why you are doing and committing this sin. Because if you knew what is right, if you fully understood love, then you would not be trapped in the sin that you're constantly falling into. But there is a caveat. And according to Kierkegaard, that caveat is sometimes God will let you stumble and let you fall and let you be tempted. And he says, here as everywhere is what the old devotional books explain, that God sometimes lets the believer stumble and fall in some temptation or other, precisely in order to humble him and thereby to establish him better in the good. It's similar to how Epictetus, Aurelius, and the rest of the Stoics understand suffering. They see suffering, they see not only suffering, but the wrongs that you make, the sins that you do, as a way to test whether you can pick yourself up, whether you can continue on this journey. It is a test for the Stoics from the Logos to grow your virtue. If the Logos hadn't written this into the unfolding of the universe, then it wouldn't happen. But it did happen, and therefore it is written into the fabric of reality. And this is the way Stoics understanding, and that's why for them, whatever happens to you, whether it's a suffering that you face, they all happen to you because it is for your own good. And it is in the grand planning of the Logos. And that's why when you read the Stoics, if you haven't listened to the Stoics, listen to the last episode I did with Marcus Aurelius. They can say things like, choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been harmed. And this is what Marcus Aurelius says. And that episode with Marcus Aurelius is episode 31. Now, the most important part of Kierkegaard's solution to despair is love. He writes, let us speak about this very humanly. How pitiable is the person who has never been motivated by love to sacrifice everything for the sake of love, and consequently has never been able to do it. But suppose he discovered that precisely this, his love-motivated sacrifice, could become the greatest unhappiness for the other person. For the beloved, what then? One of two things would happen. Either his love would lose its resiliency from being a life force. It would subside into a brooding over mournful feelings closed up within. He would give up love, would not dare to perform this act of love, even collapsing, not under the act, but under the weight of that possibility. Just as a weight becomes ever so much heavier when it is placed on the end of a rod and the lifter has to hold it by the opposite end, so every act becomes ever so much heavier when it becomes dialectical, and heaviest of all when it becomes sympathetic dialectic. And so that what love motivates him to do, a concern for the beloved, seems in another sense to dissuade from doing. Or love would conquer, and he would venture the act out of love. But in the joyousness of love, as love is always joyous, particularly when it sacrifices everything, there would still be a profound grief, for it was indeed possible. Therefore, he would complete his task of love. He would make the sacrifice in which he, for his part, would exult, but not without tears. There hovers over this. What should it be called? This historical painting of the inner life, that gloomy possibility. And yet, had this not hovered over it, his act would not have been an act of true love. Oh, my friend, how have you been tried in life? Cudgel your brain, tear away every covering in your breast, and expose the viscera of feeling. Demolish every defense that separates you from the person you are reading about. And then read Shakespeare, and you will be appalled at the collisions. But even Shakespeare seems to have recoiled from essentially religious collisions. Indeed, perhaps these can be expressed only in the language of the gods, and no human being can speak from this language. As a Greek has always said so beautifully, from men, man learns to speak, from the gods to be silent. To love is to sacrifice getting injured. To love is to expose yourself. To love is to shed the barriers that separate you from the other person. And in shedding that, obviously you become vulnerable. And it is only in that moment of vulnerability can true love embrace the other person and in so doing embrace yourself. Again, for Kierkegaard, as we mentioned earlier, if you don't act out in love, then you are a coward. Because if you know that you're supposed to do something out in love and you don't do it, you are nothing more than a mere skeleton pretending to love when in fact you don't actually understand what love is. And so you must continually love. You must not let sin enter such that it prevents you from loving. So Kierkegaard writes, the law for the growth of this continuity is not the same as the law for the increment of a debt or a negation. For a debt does not grow because it is not paid. It grows every time it is not increased. But sin grows every moment that one does not take leave of it. The sinner is so mistaken in regarding only each new sin as an increase in sin that from the point of view of Christianity, the state of sin is actually greater sin than the new sin. Whenever you're in a situation where you can act out of love or out of hatred or out of anger, and you choose anger, he'll say this is sin. If you continue to do this, the state of sin in your life grows. And what's important to take note of is not how many new sins you have, but it's how large of a body of sin it has grown to. And it reminded me of something that the Buddha wrote in the Dhammapada. And he said something like, an ill-thatched house, when it rains, when the monsoon comes, it leaks and floods the house. And so your mind, a mind that is mastered by emotions, mastered by sin, is like this house. But you instead, the Buddha goes on to say, you should be like a house that's well thatched. So when the monsoon rain comes and it's pouring down your house, there is no leakage and you can continue to live in this house. And so you, in your life, should act out of love every single time and not let the sin grow. The challenge for this week is one, to recognize and embrace your true self. And you do that through reflection. You do that through continual contemplation in accepting this paradoxical nature that you inhabit as a human being, this finitude and infinitude, right? Kierkegaard's emphasis is that true despair comes when you and I have a lack of self-awareness, not only just self-awareness, but when we reject our true self. The second challenge is very much related to this, to harmoniously integrate the finite and the infinite, to not neglect one over the other. Avoid getting lost in the extreme of purely either pursuing material things or purely abstract things and never really integrating two of them harmoniously. It's very tempting to live a life as a hermit, just to be engaged in this intellectual pursuit, living by yourself, never having to engage anybody else. But that is not the type of life that stimulates true growth. As we looked at the last episode with Thich Nhat Hanh, he says, we Buddhist monks, Zen Buddhist monks specifically, live in a Sangha because we want to practice the things that we are learning, and we are able to love each other in community, because living in community, in very close-knit communities, it's in one sense much more difficult to do than living in a city. And the last challenge is, if you're religious, and this also relates to if you're not religious, but first, if you're religious, Kierkegaard's criticism of the superficial religious observances that the majority of people do, don't do that. Embrace true faith. Get deep. Understand love. Go beyond the merely ritualistic practices and integrate your faith into your life. And if you're not religious, be sincere about your beliefs. But not only that, don't be shallow. Take time to study, to understand. And again, whether you're religious or not, the most important is to embrace love and to act in love. With that, I'll wrap. By the way, I launched a Patreon page where you can support my work through paid subscription. Patreon helps make this work possible. I easily spend over 30 hours making every episode, and I love it. I want you to see your subscription as a vote, not only of support, but of creating a world where we can bring wisdom from history's greatest mind to every single person. And I understand that not everyone will want to support the podcast this way, and that's totally okay. I appreciate your presence regardless. If you're not ready to become a patron, but enjoy my work, continue to listen to it, share with others, and help spread wisdom in the world. But for those seeking more access, upgrading to a paid subscription is the best way to connect with me, my work, to support what I am doing here. And that's my pitch for you. Thank you. Till next week. Peace.